The killer was born in an ancient Greenland glacier, a monument of ice calved from its parent eons before the first human ever built a fire. For thousands of years it had drifted south, a silent, blue-white ghost on the currents of the North Atlantic. It had survived storms that would have torn lesser ships to pieces and basked in the eerie glow of the aurora borealis. By the spring of 1912, it was a colossal, jagged cathedral of ice, its majority hidden beneath the waves, waiting patiently in the darkness. It was not evil, it was simply there, an indifferent titan of the old world, lying in wait for a new world's grandest creation. It was waiting for the RMS Titanic. This is not the story you think you know. Beyond the star-crossed lovers of fiction, beyond the simple narrative of a ship that hit an iceberg, lies a deeper, more complex American saga. The Titanic was not just a British ship. It was the crown jewel of a company owned by the American tycoon J.P. Morgan. It was a floating Babylon of the Gilded Age, filled with the titans of American industry, their wives and mistresses, and, far below, in the rocking squalor of steerage, the hopes of hundreds of immigrants whose only destination was the shores of the United States. This is the story of their dreams, their last hours, and the American reckoning that followed, a national trauma that would shatter an era of blissful arrogance and forever change the world. A floating palace of American ambition. On April 10, 1912, the port of Southampton, England, buzzed with an electric energy. The RMS Titanic, the largest and most luxurious moving object ever built by man, was ready for her maiden voyage. She was a technological marvel, a physical manifestation of the era's boundless optimism and its unshakable faith in progress. With her watertight compartments, she was famously, fatally, deemed unsinkable. On her passenger list was a who's who of American high society, a collection of wealth and power so vast it was as if a corner of Wall Street and Fifth Avenue had been transplanted to the sea. At the top of this gilded pyramid was Colonel John Jacob Astor IV. At 47, he was arguably the richest man on the planet, a real estate magnate, inventor, and veteran of the Spanish-American War. But he was also at the center of a raging society scandal. He had recently divorced his first wife and married Madeline Talmadge Force, a beautiful 18-year-old, a year younger than his own son. To escape the wagging tongues of New York society, they had embarked on a long honeymoon in Europe and Egypt. Now Madeline was 5 months pregnant, and they were returning home to America for the birth of their child. Astor, impeccably dressed and exuding an aura of untouchable authority, boarded the ship with his young wife, his valet, her maid, a private nurse, and his beloved Airedale Terrier, Kitty. For them, the Titanic was not just a ship, it was a private, floating fortress against public opinion. Not far from the Astors was another titan of industry, Benjamin Guggenheim, of the famous mining family. A notorious playboy, Guggenheim was traveling not with his wife, but with his French mistress, the singer Leontine Aubart. He boarded with his valet, his chauffeur, and a cloud of continental sophistication. For him, the voyage was a discreet, luxurious interlude, a final week of European indulgence before returning to the responsibilities of his American life.
Representing a different kind of American wealth were Isidor and Ida Straus. The German Jewish immigrants had built a retail empire from a humble crockery stand in the basement of R.H. Macy's department store, eventually becoming its sole owners. Now in their 60s, they were known throughout New York for their philanthropy and their deep, unwavering devotion to each other. After decades of marriage, they were rarely seen apart, and friends remarked that they were like inseparable sweethearts. They were returning from a winter holiday in the south of France. And then there was Margaret Molly Brown, the daughter of poor Irish immigrants. She had married a Colorado mining engineer who struck it rich. Now fabulously wealthy, she was still considered new money by the likes of the Astors, and was often snubbed by high society for her plain-spoken, boisterous manner. She was tough, resilient, and utterly unimpressed by the snobbery of the elite. She was returning to America from a trip to see her daughter in France, a journey she cut short upon hearing her first grandchild was ill. These were the kings and queens of the Titanic's floating kingdom. Their days were a blur of extravagant meals in the cavernous dining saloon, strolls along the promenade deck, games of bridge in the smoking room, and workouts in the state-of-the-art gymnasium with its electric camel. They were living in a bubble of supreme confidence, insulated from the world by their immense wealth and the perceived invincibility of the ship they occupied. But far below their feet, in the crowded, noisy, and vibrant world of third class, a different American story was unfolding. Here were the dreamers. Over 700 men, women, and children were packed into steerage, the majority of them immigrants bound for a new life in America. They were Irish farmers fleeing poverty, Scandinavian families seeking land, and a large contingent of Lebanese and Syrian immigrants escaping the turmoil of the Ottoman Empire. Among them was a young, ambitious Irishman named Daniel Buckley. He and a small group of friends had pooled their money to buy passage, their heads filled with visions of the opportunities that awaited them in New York. Their world was not one of Turkish baths and French cafes, but of shared bunks, communal dining halls, and the constant throbbing hum of the ship's massive engines. Their days were spent on the aft well deck, playing music, dancing, and sharing stories of the lives they hoped to build. For them, the Titanic was not a luxury, it was a ferry to the future. They didn't just want to visit America, they wanted to become Americans. For 4 days, the ship steamed across a placid, unnaturally calm Atlantic. The weather was beautiful, the sea like a sheet of glass. But as the Titanic sailed further west, a new presence entered the story. Wireless telegraph operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride began to receive a steady stream of ice warnings from other ships in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. Ice report, iceberg sighted. Much ice reported. Have passed several large icebergs. These messages were relayed to the bridge, but they seemed to cause little alarm. Captain Edward Smith was a veteran of the White Star Line, the millionaire's captain, on his final voyage before retirement. The pressure to make good time on this high-profile maiden voyage was immense. The ship did not slow down. On the night of Sunday, April 14th, the Titanic was racing through the darkness at over 22 knots, a black behemoth on a black sea, charging headlong into a known ice field. The air temperature had dropped to near freezing. The sky was clear, moonless, and filled with a billion stars. The perfect conditions, ironically, for spotting an iceberg late. With no moon and no waves breaking against its base, a berg would be a dark phantom, nearly invisible until it was too late.
There was no deafening crash, no violent collision. For many on board, it was a subtle, almost gentle shudder. In the first-class smoking room, John Jacob Astor felt it as a slight jolt that rattled the ice in his drink. He remarked to a friend that he thought they'd hit something. In steerage, the impact was more pronounced. Daniel Buckley was thrown from his bunk by the terrible grinding, scraping noise. He and his friends, laughing nervously, dressed and went to see what had happened. Below the waterline, the damage was catastrophic. The iceberg had not ripped a single gash in the hull, as was long believed. Instead, the immense pressure of the impact had popped the rivets and buckled the steel plates along a 300-foot stretch, opening up 6 of the ship's 16 watertight compartments to the sea. The ship's designers had planned for the flooding of 4.
The flooding of 6 was a death sentence. The unsinkable ship was sinking. At first, there was no panic, only confusion. But as the ship's bow began to dip noticeably, and the crew began uncovering the lifeboats, a quiet, creeping dread took hold. On the boat deck, a strange, surreal scene unfolded. The ship's band, led by Wallace Hartley, assembled and began to play cheerful ragtime tunes, a desperate attempt to keep spirits up and maintain order. The sound of their music would provide a haunting, courageous soundtrack to the night's unfolding horror. The evacuation was a chaos of class distinction and tragic miscalculation. The order was women and children first, but in practice it was often first class women and children first. John Jacob Astor saw his young, pregnant wife, Madeline, safely into Lifeboat 4. He asked the officer in charge, Second Officer Charles Lightoller, if he might join her, citing her delicate condition. Lightoller, a rigid enforcer of the rules, refused. "No men are allowed in these boats until the women are loaded first," he stated coldly. Astor stepped back without argument. He simply asked for the lifeboat's number, tossed his gloves to his wife, and stood back to watch her being lowered to the sea. He was last seen on the tilting deck, calmly smoking a cigar with his dog, Kitty, at his side. Benjamin Guggenheim and his valet returned to their cabins and changed into their formal evening wear. They reappeared on deck, brandy in hand. "We've dressed in our best and are prepared to go down as gentlemen," Guggenheim famously declared. He gave a message to a surviving stewardess. "If anything should happen to me, tell my wife in New York that I played the game out straight to the end. No woman shall be left on board this ship because Ben Guggenheim was a coward." Ida Straus was offered a seat in Lifeboat 8. She prepared to get in, then stopped and turned back to her husband, Isidor. "We have lived together for many years," she said, her voice firm. "Where you go, I go." She refused to leave him. They were last seen sitting together in deck chairs, holding hands as the water washed over the deck. Meanwhile, Molly Brown was a force of nature. She was hustled into Lifeboat 6, which was launched dangerously underfilled. As it rowed away from the sinking ship, she began to argue with the quartermaster in charge, Robert Hitchens. She urged him to go back to pick up more survivors from the water. Hitchens, terrified the boat would be swamped, refused. For the rest of the night, Molly Brown would organize the women in her boat, urging them to row, giving up her own fur coat to a freezing survivor, and battling with Hitchens, her indomitable spirit a beacon of hope in the freezing darkness. Far below, in third class, it was a different world. Daniel Buckley and his friends found their way blocked by locked gates and impassive stewards. Panic was mounting as water began to pour into the lower decks. In a desperate surge, Buckley and a group of men managed to break through a barrier and scramble up to the boat deck. It was a scene of chaos. As one of the last lifeboats was being loaded, Buckley saw his chance. He was wearing a woman's shawl over his head, which he had grabbed in the confusion. As he jumped into the boat, a crewman tried to stop him, but one of the female passengers covered for him, and he was allowed to stay. He was one of the few third-class men to survive. Most were trapped below, their dreams of America drowning in the icy Atlantic. 2:20 a.m. The end came with a terrifying apocalyptic roar. The great ship, its bow submerged and its stern lifted high into the starlit sky, broke in two. The stern section hung vertically for a moment, a black silhouette against the stars, before beginning its final 2.5-mile plunge to the ocean floor. The screams of the 1,500 people left on board and in the freezing water were a sound the survivors would never forget. Then, an eerie, devastating silence fell over the North Atlantic, broken only by the quiet weeping in the lifeboats.
The American Reckoning.
For hours, the survivors drifted in their scattered lifeboats, a tiny flotilla of grief on an immense black ocean. Just before dawn, they saw a light. It was the RMS Carpathia, a Cunard liner that had heard the Titanic's distress calls and had raced through the same dangerous ice field at a reckless speed to come to their aid. The rescue was a slow, painful process. One by one, the 705 survivors were hauled aboard, many of them frozen, all of them in a state of profound shock. Molly Brown's lifeboat was among the last to be picked up. Once on board the Carpathia, she didn't rest. She helped make lists of the survivors, found blankets and supplies, and established a survivors committee that would raise thousands of dollars for the destitute third-class passengers before they even reached New York. As the Carpathia steamed towards New York with its human cargo of tragedy, the world waited, desperate for news. Confused, often wildly inaccurate reports filled the newspapers. Some headlines even claimed the Titanic was being safely towed to Halifax. But as the days passed, the horrifying truth began to emerge. On the evening of April 18, the Carpathia sailed into a fog-shrouded New York harbor. Over 40,000 people stood waiting in the pouring rain at Pier 54, a silent, heartbroken crowd. As the survivors disembarked, the widows in their black veils, the stunned children, the steerage passengers with nothing but the clothes on their backs, the full scale of the tragedy finally hit America. The nation's grief quickly turned to outrage. How could this have happened? How could the unsinkable ship sink, taking 1,500 souls with it? The American press and public demanded answers, and Washington listened. Less than 24 hours after the Carpathia docked, the United States Senate launched its own inquiry, moving faster and more aggressively than the British. The investigation was led by Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan, a populist Republican with a reputation as a fierce bulldog. He was determined to get the truth, and he was not intimidated by the powerful British shipping interests. Smith immediately subpoenaed J. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line, who had survived by stepping into one of the last lifeboats. He held Ismay and the surviving officers in New York, preventing them from returning to England. The hearings were a national sensation. For weeks, Senator Smith relentlessly interrogated the witnesses, from the shell-shocked officers to the humble lookouts. The testimony revealed a horrifying litany of failures: the ignored ice warnings, the reckless speed, the locked gates in steerage, the lifeboats launched half-empty, and perhaps most shockingly, the revelation that the lookouts in the crow's nest had no binoculars. They had been left behind in Southampton. The American inquiry was a brutal, public dissection of the arrogance and negligence that had led to the disaster. It was a direct challenge to the British maritime establishment, and it established America's new role as a global power. The inquiry's final report led to sweeping, fundamental changes in maritime safety regulations. It mandated enough lifeboats for all passengers, established 24-hour radio watches on all ships, and led to the creation of the International Ice Patrol, a service run by the U.S. Coast Guard to this day, which monitors icebergs in the North Atlantic. Epilogue: The Echo in the Deep. The Titanic disaster was more than just a shipwreck. It was the end of an era. It was a brutal, icy lesson in humility for a Gilded Age that believed it had conquered nature. The sinking shattered the illusion of a world governed by wealth, class, and technological infallibility. On the tilting decks of the Titanic, money and status became meaningless. John Jacob Astor, the richest man on board, died. Daniel Buckley, a poor Irish immigrant, survived. Madeline Astor survived, inheriting a fortune, but she was forever haunted, a recluse for much of her life. Molly Brown, once snubbed by society, became a national hero, her toughness and compassion celebrated. J. Bruce Ismay, the man who survived, was branded a coward and lived out his life in disgrace. For over 70 years, the ship itself remained lost, a ghost in the deep. Then, in 1985, a joint American-French expedition led by Dr. Robert Ballard finally found her, sitting upright on the ocean floor, her broken sections a silent, ghostly monument. The story of the Titanic endures because it is a profoundly human story, a drama played out on a grand stage. But at its heart, it is also a quintessentially American story. It's the story of ambition and hubris, of immigrants seeking a new beginning, and of a nation that, in the face of an unthinkable tragedy, demanded accountability and forced the world to change. The great ship never made it to New York, but its legacy arrived with the survivors on the Carpathia, a legacy of sorrow, of lessons learned, and of dreams that now lie forever preserved in the cold, dark silence of the deep.